All right, welcome everybody. Excited to get into a panel discussion. I'm joined by four of my friends and colleagues today that I'm excited to introduce to you. I'm Stefan Underwood, performance coach at Exos. Been here for 10 years and work on our staff development and methodology team. But I'm joined by four people that have, more experience cumulatively than most teams around. I'm really excited to introduce them to you. I'm just going to look left to right on my screen. We'll start with Omi Iwasaki. Omi is a physical therapist by trade. He joined Exos in 2003, was one of the first physical therapists that we had. And you look over that length of that career, and he has been trusted with the rehab of more big name athletes, as well as just people who are high performers that want to live their life to the fullest than pretty much any physical therapist I've ever been around. Omi, man, thanks for joining us. Appreciate you taking time.
Thank you.
He's coming from LA. Brent Calloway is over in Texas. Brent, man, thanks for joining us. Brent is our director of Pro Elite Sports. And again, when you just talk about sort of experience working in a space, if you go NFL Combine alone, like irrespective of other sports and irrespective of NFL offseason, things like that, just the NFL Combine, you're at what, 17 years now, BC?
17, yep.
And across those 17 years, how many athletes have you helped prep for the NFL Combine? About?
For the Combine, plus or minus about 600.
So a few.
Yeah.
All right. Yeah. I appreciate that. And been with the company for 14 years. So a lot of experience and have worked at multiple of our facilities in that time and worn a lot of hats for us. Thanks for joining. Chris Bertram, Dr. Chris Bertram. Doctor is with us today. Chris Bertram is up in Chilliwack, BC, outside Vancouver. He is the newest member to our team, having been around our ecosystem now for about a year. But Chris is an academic and an applied neuroscientist. So PhD in applied neuroscience, working in an academic in a university setting for much of his career, but also a lot of time in an applied setting, a lot of different environments, including consulting out to groups like the Canadian Olympic snowboard team. Chris is going to bring a perspective on everything neuroscience. Chris, thanks for joining us.
Happy to be here.
And as I finish off left to right, that brings me to Shannon Earhart. Shannon is a registered dietitian and a CSCS, so she can talk a strength coach game, but more than anything, she is here to really represent the nutrition or the dietetics side of the conversation today. She's been with us for about 5 years, working in everything from our corporate settings to working with our nutrition partner on it, through to being in our elite facilities, supporting all of our pro elite athletes in Arizona, coming to us from Phoenix. So gang, thanks for joining us. I suppose we should announce what we're talking about. It's obviously titled in the on the page, but we are here to talk about assessment. And really, at the end of the day, like, what data matters and what should we be getting in assessment, but not only what and why, but like when and how. So really getting into both the science and the art of assessment, because I think it's easy to get blinders on and focus way too much on the pieces of data or the science that I need to gather and forget that we've got a living, breathing human in front of us, right? So for the next 45 minutes, for all of you that have joined us for this panel discussion, that's what the clear goal of this discussion is going to be, is to go through getting all our cards on the table. And what I mean by that is, what are all of the data points that we may look at Exos with an athlete coming to join us? And that will lend itself to the science. What are the things we want to learn about a person when they're coming to join us? But then get into the nuanced conversation of how we do that, on what timelines, and then most importantly, how we integrate as a staff to provide this athlete-centric, holistic approach to support the person. That's why we've got 4 people from 4 different skill sets or backgrounds joining us. So with that, let's roll. Chris, I'm going to come over to you first, because you own so much of that sphere for us of what's taking place above the shoulders. Not to overly simplify, but right, neuroscience, I'm going to overly simplify for a moment, say you got above the shoulders. And we talk about values, goals, motivations, the important things of what a person wants. And I always think, if I tell a story for a minute, I was working with a pro golfer. This was years back. I was a much younger strength coach at the time. And I forgot to I made assumptions of what this individual was there for. Now, he was from a South American country, spoke limited English. I spoke limited Spanish. So we had a bit of a communication barrier. That's not an excuse. We should be able to get through that. I made assumptions about him as a pro golfer, young pro golfer. He's 19 years old. and he was playing on the Hooters tour in your neck of the wood, Brent, down in Texas, trying to make the PGA. And real small, skinny kid, 19 years old, and he came in wanting to work on golf. And so I'm making assumptions about rotational, mobility, stability, translation of, rotational force or power. And I'm writing what I'm thinking as a young strength coach is the best program on the face of the planet for this guy. And just body language, he wasn't into it. I finally managed to get, talk with his agent, who spoke better English. And she very simply said, he's 19. He's just moved to Texas. He's on the Hooters tour. He's looking to train for physique. He wants to feel more confident having conversations with women. And so he was looking for physique, and I'm telling everything about like how we're going to help his drive, right? Like he didn't care about his drive. And so Chris, kick us off if you would, and maybe start talking about that idea of understanding the person who's in front of you, because we're just there to support their journey, right?
Yeah. Yeah. So when it comes to that piece of what's happening from the shoulders up, I kind of break this into two categories: the things that we can look at, the things we can assess, and the things that we can have a direct impact on. Some of them are around like just what are your basic starting coordinates? And that gets into things like what drives you, what are those motivational factors, what are those goals? Being really clear about that, both for the sake of the athlete themselves, but also for the sake of alignment with that athlete. So you talked about, having some assumptions about what that person's drivers and motives and goals might be, and they were not aligned until you sort of got down to the bottom of it.
Right.
So we take a look at what are those drivers, then we might try to work with them on how we can find maybe a better source of motivation other than how jacked you can get for the purposes of furthering your golf career. We might touch on that piece, but understanding goals and motivations and drive and all those things are really important pieces of information to understand up front. But there's more. So, beyond that, we would look at, where do you stand on the fixed versus growth mindset spectrum, right? In other words, what is your basic relationship with struggle, with challenge, and failure? It's a really interesting and important piece of information to gather right up front. Beyond that, we look into what is the person's basic internal awareness? How much do they notice what is happening inside of them in terms of what thoughts are running through their head, what emotional state are they in, and what is their body feeling like in response to those things? So understanding and being able to assess somebody's basic ability to have internal awareness, another really important piece of this. From there, we get into more of, what can we shift? What can the person do with those starting points, right? So one of the terms that we use is self-regulation. So if you know that you're in a certain state, are you able to move it? If you're feeling a little bit under-regulated when it shows up to training day, can you dial it up? If you're feeling a little bit overamped on game day, can you turn it down and find that sweet spot again? So how are you able to regulate yourself? And we can measure and assess that. And then the last two have to do with, what is the person's basic relationship like with flow state, that optimal state of consciousness where we perform our best? Do people understand that? Do they have much of it? Because that's another thing that we can influence. And then finally, it's looking at what the relationship is with this word grit and how long they can sustain that high performance over time and how recovery starts to fold into that equation as well. So that's what we're looking for in terms of the data points and how we can quantify some things at the outset.
So you putting all your cards on the table, so to speak, the data points. I was making notes while you were talking to make sure I get this back. You're talking about motivation orientation, essentially. Are they intrinsic, extrinsically motivated, looking at the source of motivation? You mentioned to make sure that everyone listening takes time to understand that about their clients, because intrinsic motivation is that durable source of motivation. You said we should be looking at our mindset orientation. Are we growth or fixed minded? I assume a lot of these come with questionnaires, right? And just the line of questioning, and not even that doesn't have to be official questionnaires, but just in the conversations you have, figure out growth minded versus fixed minded, their ability to have inner awareness or self-awareness, self-regulate, how prone they are to flow state, and then how much grit they can display. Those are the points that you're interested from above the shoulders perspective coming in.
Yeah, and there are, as you mentioned, there are formal assessments you can utilize there. and there are other informal ways of getting at, the same thing in a bit more of an informal way.
But yeah, no, that's perfect. But you agree that the most important thing is understanding upfront what they want, what their expectations are, right?
Right.
You've got a story you've told me before. If I can get you to share it, you got to share that story.
This gets to the issue of goals as one of those initial conditions you really want to make sure you're aligned to your athlete on, because depending on what their big long-term goals are, their big outcome goals, in the moment we have goals too. And there's a great story from, you mentioned I'm lucky enough to work with our national snowboard team, and specifically with the big air team, the craziest people on earth who send themselves off 100-foot jumps, where the margin for error is extremely small. And during the Olympic Games last time, one of our riders had, done really well in their first run, landed a big jump, big trick, successful, and showed up. They get 2 runs. And so it was time for the second one. And really, everybody who was associated with that, he was sitting in second place at the time. And all he really needed to do was put down any number of tricks that he could do in his sleep, and he was guaranteed a podium position almost without any question. And so when he came up to the tower getting ready to drop in, he walked up to the coaches, and the coaches looked at him, and he just said, "Look, I know what you're going to say. I've already got a medal with that color on it. I'm here for gold. I'm going to go for gold, or I'm going to go to the hospital." And at that point, okay, we've got alignment. What are the goals? What can we do then? Hey, you want a drink of water? We've got alignment. That matters, right? So then we can all get committed on what is to come next.
Yeah, no, and that's so key. Understanding, getting to know the person, and you called out. You need to know their big outcome goal. We're dealing with athletes; they're going to have an outcome goal. Like you talk about an outcome goal versus a process goal. They're going to have an outcome goal. I want to be an MVP. I want to win a Super Bowl. I want a gold medal. I guess the point of the conversation here, as we pull in others on this panel, is to say those data points you're asking about, those 6 that you mentioned, Chris, and I'm going to come to the others now and find their sort of data points that they feel is important to get. That's letting us determine the gaps, preventing them or holding them back from that outcome goal, so that we can identify process goals, specifically 3 to 5 process goals per outcome goal, to create the game plan to get a person there. So Brent, BC, I want to come over to you for a minute. We've talked about, you got to understand what's driving the person. You got to understand the person in front of you, what they want, their expectations. Where do you go from there?
There's loads of different places you can go, right? So you figure out who they are, and then you need to figure out what you have, right, as far as an athlete goes. So getting a contextual understanding of the athlete, I think, helps to paint the picture of the programming that's needed. And then, as Chris was mentioning, the goals that they have set for themselves and how you can support those goals. So in the pro sports programs that we have inside of our company, there's a multitude of different testing batteries that we can use. If we're training an athlete for the NFL Combine, there's obviously the 40-yard dash that we want to accomplish so that we can understand, how fast they are, if we're going to speed profile them. So how well they get off the line, how well they execute drive phase, how well they finish a 40, broad jumps and vertical jump profiling, changing of direction. All of those things they're standard, right? Because you're preparing an athlete to test. So that actually makes it a lot easier in some cases. There's other cases where it's not as easy. If you have an athlete who is 32 years old and in the 11th year of their NFL career or Major League Baseball career, for example, some of the testing might need to be a little bit different because those guys aren't always very ready to go out and sprint full speed, 6 to 8 weeks before their season starts. So you have to be able to understand what you have in other ways. And, that's where we can get into force velocity profiling. I think vertical jump profiling is a really good way to understand who you have and how an athlete produces force and reutilizes force. So there's several things that are inside of there. And a big part from my understanding of an athlete comes from what Omi is going to collect from a physical therapy standpoint, and me being able to see what he has and have the conversation with him, or understanding what Shannon has collected from a dietitian standpoint in knowing what I have as far as the athlete goes and what their body comp is and different things of that sort. But yeah, all of those pieces are important.
Yeah, no, that's good. And I assume you didn't mention it, but I would assume being in my background, depending on the sport, metabolic capacity, metabolic profile as well, potentially,
Yeah,
right? So
absolutely.
you identified sort of, again, I'm looking at notes. You sort of put in the bucket of all of base that force velocity profiling is you're looking at characteristics of, strength, power, and speed. You mentioned, coming in and being able to look, I just threw in metabolic capacity, but then you said a big one was what you wanted to figure out from OMI or from physical therapist you're working with. So you sort of talking movement efficiency or any underlying injury risk or injury history or precursors, any red flags or things to be identified, right?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, the first thing I'm going to do is pop open, a medical history and start to
Yep.
dig into what is already lying inside of there so that we can hopefully troubleshoot that. And then, our physical therapists are going to be able to give us just a full battery of information. It's like the full diagnostic you take in on your vehicle whenever you take your car in to get it checked and changed and whatnot. I need to know that information so that I can see all those pieces and then guide programming in an efficient way.
So let's jump across to OMI then. OMI, if you're talking about movement efficiency from a therapist's perspective,
Yep.
what type of things are you looking for when an athlete joins us? And I suppose I should say, I'm guessing there's a different lens there, whether we're talking about a rehab
and that's where I was going to go.
Absolutely. Yeah. Okay. So go with that.
The easy one is if they're coming for formal rehab. They're coming for post-surgery or post-injury and some sort of formal rehab. That's quite easy because they're coming to you for that purpose. So we start with an assessment, and depending on what stage of healing they are or post-surgical they are. Usually start with some sort of body weight competency type of movement screen, if you will.
Okay.
And then start to break it down into smaller components and then look at the individual parts. Now, post-surgical, you might be able to only look at the individual part just to understand kind of general, like just say they had post-surgery on a knee. We'll look at the knee and we'll look at the other parts in time. But then you have the flip side where you do have an athlete that's coming to train and you look at their medical history and there's nothing on there. You know some of these athletes, they've had injuries, some of them have been in the news and some of their injury history, but they don't tell you. So, and some of them don't want to be evaluated. So at that time, ideally you would like to look at some sort of body weight competency and some sort of movement screening up top and then break them down no different than you would, someone coming in for rehab. But at times they don't want to do that. So the strongest thing the tool that I have is my eyes to watch them train, watch them with their session, talk with the coach. You can pick up on things just purely on how they move with, we have a structured kind of training session. They're going to go through some sort of structured pillar prep or movement prep. You can kind of start to get ideas of how they move purely based on that. And then you start to ask them, hey, is that bothering you? And they go, oh yeah, I've had this thing for years. It's not a big deal. It's like, so, but you have to earn their trust first. And that does take time. But some of them were like, hey, I'm not going to be evaluated. I just want to train.
Yeah. Right.
Okay.
So obviously level of importance and level of depth maybe changes based on if they're there for rehab versus if they're just a healthy athlete coming to train. But at the end of the day, you still sort of said body weight competency. So staying agnostic there, but we're talking about things like a SFMA or FMS. Or
something of that nature.
3D maps, like whatever a person wants to do, but look at how a person moves, just them, their body and gravity. Yeah.
Yeah. It tells you the big picture first. Can they squat? Can they hinge? Can they bend over, touch their toes? Can they back bend? Can they lift their arms over the head? Like basic things to try to understand some of those patterns, which is no different than like a well-balanced movement-based training plan, right? You have to be able to hinge. You got to be able to squat. You got to be able to push, press, vertical, horizontal, like these kind of components. It gives you a general idea of how they move. We want to understand, do they have any painful dysfunctions? Do they also have any non-painful dysfunctions, which may be predisposing that, certain areas to be overloaded or overcompensated? So those are kind of the things that we start off with. And ideally that would be the kind of sequence if we had the time as well as the willingness of the participants.
Yeah, right. And then after that, you get to look at segmental capabilities. That's where you are trying to look at specific like ankle dorsiflexion. You're looking at like things of that nature.
Yeah.
And that's Brent, coming back to you from it. You said the things you need are what OMI or your PT is going to provide.
Yep.
What's the high value? How does that it influences your ability to have higher quality conversations with the athlete, higher quality conversations with agent or team or whoever it may be.
That's right.
Lets you get buy-in. So you're taking that sort of global movement capability and then that segmental capability. Are there things you're putting more stock in than others that you're really looking at, or you just want to get a total picture?
Yeah. So whenever I get that information from the therapist, the first thing I'm looking at is what exercises are my athletes contraindicated for, or can I also create like a generic profile inside of my head based on the athlete's deficiencies that I'm seeing. And then I almost am painting a picture of what the athlete is going to move like before I see them move. So if I know that an athlete is lacking hip extension or lacking, femoral internal rotation, et cetera, I know what that athlete's going to run like. I know the mechanics that I'm going to see. And I also start to know the cues that I can say and cannot say in order to get that athlete to sprint well. Shoot, if a guy can't pick his knees up very well because of physical limitation, and I'm trying to encourage him to get, higher front side mechanics or better front side mechanics, I'm possibly just coaching him into an injury by telling him to do that at full speed. So I need to be smart about what I have. And what I'm looking at whenever I get that report quickly, closed chain dorsiflexion, I want to know how well an athlete's ankles move. I want to know total hip arc. I want to see extension, internal rotation, external rotation. I like a supine 90-90 stretch for a hamstring. I want to see that. I like T-spine rotation and then shoulder flexion. So I want to see those specific tests and also being able to look for overall, we'll call them inefficiencies, and then also asymmetries. Based on that, I can then go back and have conversations with other coaches or the athlete. We've had this conversation a few times, Stefan, but I love objective data like that because it gives the athlete something to shoot for. If I tell an athlete, hey, you're at 19 degrees of ankle dorsiflexion, typically their next question to me is that good?
Is that good?
Yeah, right. So
it educates them, it makes them care.
Right. So if I say, look, we're looking for 35 to 40, then the next question is, okay, well, how do I get that better? And so finding things that are engaging in that way. I mean, look, if a kid goes out and runs the 4.7 and he wants to be a 4.5, he knows where he stands. And it's the same thing whenever you take those types of objective pieces like segmental measurements, like Omi was just speaking about. Those things are extremely useful for us. And even on the floor, I had a conversation with one of our coaches the other day, where a new athlete came in. It was his first day back in the building. Coach screams across the floor to me and asked what his shoulder flexion score was. I told him that contraindicated him for like an overhead shoulder press. And he said, hey, set up a landmine rotation press for this guy over here, or landmine shoulder press. And so he ended up doing that instead. And it was a much better exercise for the guy. So those type of things just come to life whenever you can get those objective measures.
Yeah, which is we got to get Shannon in the conversation on nutrition first, but that's going to get us to that whole piece on the art of, right? Like how you use this to build buy-in, why you're doing it. These aren't lab rats that we're just collecting data on, right? Like we're doing it to support them. And that's such a big piece. But Shannon, I want to get you into the conversation from an RD perspective. We know nutrition drives so much of our programming. Get your cards on the table. What are the data points? What are the things that you want to look for with the athletes that you have come in?
Yeah, well, obviously the ones that, the athletes are most interested in are what is my, body composition and how can I improve that? That's one data point that I want, their weight, obviously where they're currently at, where they need to go. Medical history for me is important, not just from like a, injury history, but like, do they have type 1 diabetes? Do they, some of those are important because those are the conversations that drive, that I have with coaches. Like, for example, this past combine, we had, I think, 5 or 6 athletes across all facilities that had sickle cell trait. Super important to know from a coach's perspective as well. And so when I'm having those conversations, like, hey, be aware of this athlete, like, and they're cramping, if it's getting really bad, make sure their hydration's on point. If they're having conversations and talking about the food, because their total calories are even more important. Their protein intake's even more important. So a lot of different things that the coaches that are seeing them on a day-to-day basis, I want to know that kind of stuff. And so that kind of medical history is really important for me. I also want to know, going kind of spinning off of Chris, like their relationship with food in general. Like, what is their knowledge base of food? How do they think that like food can help their performance? Have they connected those dots yet? And really trying to understand like where they're at, just from an education standpoint, like, and how, deep I can get into that education with that athlete kind of across the board. And then just kind of understanding what their day-to-day looks like from, a food intake perspective. And so those are kind of some of the data elements that I'm looking at.
That's awesome. And then not talking assessment and not out of the gate, like not talking day one, but other things. You've got some a la carte things you may look at, right? That you're not looking at with every single one, but if through those conversations something spiked, there are some other data points that we might get in the way of gut health or inflammation markers or micronutrient status, things like that, right?
Mm-hmm. Lab results. If they work with a team and they have blood markers that they get tested, or if we're getting blood work done, gut health markers, looking at some of those gut metabolites, because that can tell us a lot of really interesting stuff, and how things are operating kind of internally. Are they like digesting and absorbing the food that they're eating? Or is it just, they're just not even utilizing those nutrients efficiently? How is their body handling stress? Are they at a greater risk for overtraining? So a lot of those things can drive conversations as well, when we're talking with PTs and coaches, and all that kind of stuff as well. So definitely some of those internal data markers are very important too, if we can get them.
Yeah, absolutely. So if we call this the halfway mark, this was get all of our cards on the table. What are all the data points? And look, of course, it's not a comprehensive list. We all know there's a ton more special assessments that could be done. But generally speaking, I was making notes throughout there, and I'm going to verbally recount them right now. You can tell me if I missed anything. But for everybody listening, if this is the halfway mark, it's saying have a well-rounded, holistic set of data points that you can pull from. Doesn't mean that every athlete does every one of these things. And we'll get into the timelines of when we need to gather them and how in a moment. But if I'm hearing you guys right, we need medical history. You sort of, multiple of you brought it up, right? Like for different purposes, but like we need to know medical history. We need to know their goals and their motivations that, Chris, going back to you, we can align to a outcome goal. We know why they are there. We know what they want to be there for and what their expectations are. Then from there, from an above the shoulders perspective, you want to start learning about their motivation, orientation, right? Remember that one's intrinsic or extrinsic. You want to learn about their mindset orientation, growth or fixed mindset. You want to learn about their ability to have inner awareness, self-regulate, tap into flow state, and possess grit. And those are all available with reliable questions. Like those are largely questionnaire based, which you could use, Chris, a question for you. As if I'm a coach listening, can I just go Google those types of questionnaires and then not necessarily put them in front of my athlete as a questionnaire, but use that as fodder for the types of conversation or questions I'm having with them in those opening weeks as I'm building a relationship with them?
Yeah, I mean, pretty much every one of the assessments that I've mentioned, you could find a version of just by Googling it. There's some that are, a little bit more academic in nature, and you do have to pay for certain ones that have been validated a little bit more. But I think if you're looking to just, how do I even start the conversation of assessing somebody's mindset? Well, Carol Dweck has a free post on her Stanford Lab website where you can go to and just learn the kinds of questions that you could ask formally or just kind of in passing if you want to just get a little bit of information, because a little bit of information on all of these can really take you a long way.
Yeah, too easy. I love that. And then Brent, you say, listen, there's a lot of different assessments we could pick based on what we're preparing the person for, the context of their sport, different directional elements of vertical versus horizontal profiling. But in short, you were saying force velocity profiling, so looking at strength, total body power, and speed. The very little bit I've added to the conversation, I threw in, what about metabolic capacity? And then you mentioned movement efficiency, which kicked us into OMI. OMI, you were saying for movement efficiency, you need to understand by movement efficiency, you need to understand how they move their body and gravity. So again, that can be agnostic. That can be an SFMA, an FMS. It can be 3D maps. It can be watching a person go through a movement prep. Like it can be on the floor side by side with the coach. You need to start understanding that. And then you want to understand segmental capabilities, which loops back to what Brent was talking about, what he wanted, some objective measures of segmental capabilities to also drive some behavior change and some buy-in from the athlete. And then Shannon, you said that you need to understand, we already covered medical history, body composition as a first and foremost. A lot of it, I just wrote down like habits and behaviors, like a lot of what you said, if I summarize that, like, are you sort of saying like you want to understand their current relationship with food, the way they're currently eating, like their current habits and behaviors? And then you can get into other things like gut health, inflammation markers, like blood markers, things of that nature, and hydration status. So if I was listening to you guys, that's the comprehensive list. And it's not saying do everything, but that's what I want to pose to you guys. And I'm curious if you all, and this is where we'll see this, where people see that this is not rehearsed, because we might get differing opinions here. What needs to be true, but of all those things I just listed, what needs to be true before the athlete first steps on the training floor and trains with a strength coach? Is it literally just medical history? Is it sign a waiver and you're good? Are there a couple of those things you want to know before their first training session? I'm going to go to Brent and Omi as the first two of where I'm wondering if I get a difference of opinion. I'm going to put them on the spot. We'll see. Brent, what needs to be true for you before the first training session?
Gotcha. I knew you were going to come to me first. I knew it.
I can't help it. You got the degrees behind you. It just looks fancy. But Chris has one more degree behind him by the looks of it, if I'm counting.
If I have to start with an athlete, you can obviously start with an athlete at any point. Now, that means I don't specifically have to have anything. We can go in and we can start day one. However, I have a preference that's very different than, what's the full necessity. But I want to know what injury history is. And then there's some specific things. If I'm going to be sprinting an athlete, if an athlete's coming to me for speed development, something like a NordBord assessment is going to be critical to know if I'm going to sprint an athlete are his hamstrings strong enough and symmetrical enough for me to sprint them and not be concerned about it? Or are there targets that we need to hit inside of there? So there's some cool technologies that are at play in there as well that we didn't talk about yet, and we can push the pause button on that. But as far as what do we have to have, we don't have to have anything. But there are some preferences inside of there. I want medical history. I want to have a NordBord assessment of somebody sprinting, and then I also want to have segmental measurements. I feel like if I've got that, then I have everything I need to be able to start changing an athlete from day one. And a lot of that comes back to, as Omi was talking about, watching an athlete go through movement prep. I mean, when you've done something for 15, 16, 17 years, you've seen so many athletes come through. A lot of my assessment is visual as well. If I'm asking an athlete to accomplish a knee hug, I can look at single leg stance and stability, and I can look at hip flexor length, and I can look at torso stability and proximal stability. There's loads of things inside of their hip hinging that you can see, single leg squat technique that you can see, from one exercise that you can process. So there's a lot of visual assessment that's going on there too.
Yeah, absolutely. Omi, what would you say to the same question? Go to preference, not what has to be true, but preference before an athlete first goes and takes off sprinting with Brent.
Yeah, the preference obviously is what we talked about, is having the ability to evaluate them from just a global perspective, kind of this body weight competency, and then kind of breaking down those components into smaller parts and segments. We'd like to understand it, because if the dorsiflexion is down, I want to know why. I don't care necessarily that it's down. I want to know why it's down. And I also want to understand, are there relationships within their shoulder, torso, hips minimally that also point to why that area might be down? It might be down. Is it also down in painful, or is it down in non-painful? Those two are two different things as well. Mm. So, but again, what I was saying earlier, some athletes don't want to go through that. So you need to know something about them. You need to get to know them, form a quick relationship, know what school they come from, or where they went to school, or where they play, or, their hometown, or, just know things about them. It goes a long way to form that relationship, and then just watch with your eyes. You have a general sense. Your sessions are going to be fairly general in the beginning, so you get an understanding of how they move, and then we'll go from there and earn their trust. But ideal state would be obviously being able to put, my hands on them as well as watch them with my eyes. That would be ideal.
Yeah. Shannon or Chris, anything that you would add that you feel before the athlete even starts, before the first time they take off sprinting with BC, we need to know? Or do you feel good with what has been outlined?
Yeah. Okay, I'll go. Definitely agree with everything here. Personally, I would love to see lab work before I sit down and talk with somebody, only because that would help. It helps me come up with questions and helps drive my conversation with that athlete, because I'm trying to figure out why this lab value is here, or why this gut metabolite is out of here, or out of range, or whatever. So knowing those beforehand would kind of make my conversation go a little bit more efficient, I think. And also, if that lab work is telling me that they're at risk for overtraining, that's immediately something I would bring to a coach or PT or whatever that might be. So some of the internal numbers would be nice to have before I see them.
So nice to have before you see them, but before they step on the training floor and sprint with Brent. Anything from a nutrition perspective that they've got to have?
I mean, same in that same general aspect, just only because of the overtraining aspect. I mean, some of those lab values can tell us, certain ones can tell us a really interesting story from, are they having some like crazy inflammation, muscle protein breakdown already happening internally? Not to say that, they get out on the field or track and start sprinting, they're going to immediately pull a hamstring or whatever that might be. But for me, it would be an interesting conversation to have.
Yeah. Chris, anything you'd add? Again, this is not saying what you have to have. This is saying that you have to have before someone's allowed to do their first session with Brent.
Yeah, I would say, just to maybe recap, I think, you could start anywhere technically, but, the name of the game here is how do we optimize that change? How do we, expedite elevation in performance, right? And so to have some good understanding on the front end of what's going on is vital. If I was to say, from the perspective of what's going on above the shoulders, and this isn't just above the shoulders, but that inner awareness piece is really, really important. I like to know how connected somebody feels to what's happening mentally and emotionally. Are they getting dragged around by emotions all day? Do they get worked up really easily? Do they notice that? Are they, this gets into the mind-body connection, but are they feeling connected to their body? And like a really good example of this is, we talk to, extreme endurance sport athletes, and a lot of what they have to do in their athletic life is to disembody from the pain that they put themselves through. And when you get used to tuning out your body, but you start tuning out signs and indicators and signals of injury or, nutrient deficiencies or any number of things. So I like to know, how aware are you of what's going on up here, down here, and in the combination of those two?
Yeah, absolutely. I love that disembodiment. So obviously people don't know when we're recording this, but we're recording this during the Olympics, 2021 Olympics. And anyone else catch the triathlon yesterday? You talk about disembodiment, like the guy, I can't remember his name. He's from Norway. There's a pack of 3 of them going, and he looked to me hands down the most uncomfortable. And I was like, that guy's got to make it. Like, there's the bronze medal. Like, he's going to fall. He separated from the others and just was willing to hurt more. And disembodied. Like, he ended up winning the gold medal. And he looked way more painful, but he got like one step across, dropped to his knees. Next thing you know, he's puking on the finish line at the Olympics, but he had a gold medal. So
massive asset in the competitive arena, but can be a disadvantage in the training environment at times.
That's interesting. That's something I'd never thought of. So those working with endurance athletes probably really need to consider that, of what's beneficial to their performance. You need to help them flex that muscle of inner awareness, because they're liable to not pay attention where we want an athlete to be in tune with themselves and on the training floor. That's interesting. So going back to my initial intro, we talked about my golfer that wanted to talk to women, not hit the long ball. And I noticed none of you said, when I said, like, before that first training session with Brent, none of you said, I need to know what the outcome goal is. I need to know why they're there and their expectations. And I think that that's fair. So here's my question to the group, and Brent will come back to you. How long do you have until that does become a barrier to not know? So clearly I didn't know at day one, but clearly I went too long to where he was getting upset because I didn't have enough like gun show stuff at the end of the workout, and he was getting upset and he called his agent.
Curls.
Yeah, we weren't doing enough curls. So when do we need to figure that out? And I'll expand even on that and just say, of the long list we put forth of all the things you want to learn about an athlete over time, of what we need up front, you gave me a very small list. And I think that plays into the art of not inundating an athlete day one. I think that's a key piece. So finding out their goal, Brent, but then all the other things you let me know about that you want to look at. What's your timeline to then get those things? Is that week one? Is that month one? Is that like, what's your timeline to then start checking off those other things you said you want to learn?
Yeah, well, it's relative to the length of stay that we have with an athlete, which, being in the private industry, sometimes that's a week, sometimes it's a month, sometimes it's 6 months, sometimes it's a year. So we're not sure what we're going to get. If we have a little bit more time to gather that info, then we can take that time to do so. We want to try and get it quickly. And in the case of an athlete who's training in his off season, if we've got him for 3 months, then I want to get it in the first week or two. Want to make sure that we get that in. And the other part that you were starting to hit on is, an athlete comes in, they may not want to be a lab rat right away. So they may not want to go through, all of these tests like Omi was talking about. They don't want to eval, they want to come in and train. So let's get them in the flow. Let's get them in the training flow. There's loads of information that we can collect in session. I mentioned NordBoard testing. That's something that we can do if we've got a knee hinge that day. We can already have it brought up. We can pull a NordBoard out, and we can have an athlete's first set be on a NordBoard. And they can conduct their Nordic 3-rep test, and we get to score on it, and then they can rotate back in the group. Or if we have speed tests or something of that sort for the day, we've got an acceleration day. There's nothing wrong with catching, a 20-yard or a 10-yard sprint inside of there. So there are some things that you can do in session. And going back to, I think your original question, and if I missed it, then hit me again with it. But, you need to understand why the athlete is there. But we also, as they're passing through kind of person by person through our evaluation process, we got to be careful not to hit them over the head with the same question over and over as well. So as I start to build relationships with an athlete, then I start chipping away at, hey, tell me why you're here. What are the primary goals that you have before we get to season? You said you came in, you wanted to be ready for camp. What does ready mean to you? Those type things, so that I can start to create their journey inside of the programming piece.
I like that. I'm writing that down. Actually, we need to put that into some of our internal education we have. If I'm hearing you right, you're saying have your list of stuff you want to assess, then prioritize your list, and then figure out what on your list needs to be a formal quote unquote assessment versus what can organically fit into training or into organic conversation. Mm-hmm. And then just start picking off your list from there. But is it fair to say you want to get as much as possible in that organic bucket? But you're setting up your conversations as they go based on this list that you have of saying, these are all the different performance qualities I want to assess, that any one of which could be a gap preventing them from getting to their outcome goal.
Yep, that's right. And back, Omi and I used to work together back in Los Angeles, and we had a formal process where the athletes would sit down in a conference room with us for 20 minutes. And we would go through, a questionnaire of let's talk like interview style, what your goals are. And sometimes that was first day. And it was probably 50-50 if you got any good info on that or not. But if I've got an athlete that's out on the floor in the middle of a group and I'm coaching them through movement prep, and I can walk up while they're going through the quad stretch or a world's greatest stretch or, an exercise like that. And I can give them a little bit of coaching, and then I can ask them a few questions about what their goals are. You're going to get a lot better feedback that way. And it's quick and it's concise and it's genuine, and it happens in a real nice flow as well, in my opinion. And that's how I like to operate versus a formal sit down. I don't even know you guy, but tell me why you're here. I want that to be conversational.
I know that's your style too, Shannon, right? Like I see you out on the floor talking with people. You don't want to just do the whole hi, I'm Shannon, I'm your RD, get on the scale.
Yeah, and that's what sometimes it kind of goes to that where it's like, okay, you're going to go meet with the dietitian. Okay, they go into the room and they sit down and we start talking, and I kind of open the conversation, letting them talk about it, because sometimes the conversation lasts 5 minutes because they're just not ready to open up and talk to me at all, and that's okay. That doesn't mean that I can't learn more by going out on the floor and interacting with the athletes where they feel comfortable, right? Because a lot of times they're not in their element when they're sitting in an office and trying to tell you about their goals and stuff like that. So it's definitely understanding, reading the athlete. Sometimes they'll come and sit down and they'll just start telling me their whole life story, and I don't even have to ask a question, right? And they're already taking their shirt off. I'm ready for the body comp, that sort of stuff. But no, the last thing I want to do when I can tell somebody's uncomfortable is like, all right, hop on the scale. Let's get all this data stuff out of the way. And then, so trying to definitely get to know the person and develop that relationship is really important to me. And then kind of working with them. And if I can tell that they're more comfortable in their own element, then I'll go, pick them, pick their brains out on the field. Or I hear something from a coach, this past the combine, I heard, this athlete he's not hitting his PRs and he's struggling, and, like, can you just talk to him and see? And so just trying to dig a little bit and find out that all he's doing is eating salads because all he cares about is hitting a 4% body composition. And so trying to like dig and find out, like, hey, is body fat percentage more important to you, or, running a 4.4? Like, where are your priorities here? Let's talk about this, and trying to help them connect the dots that they can have both, but there's definitely education there. So
I think that's really well said. Is like, that is the whole point here, right? Like, that is the point of assessment. They're not lab rats. We're not doing it to collect, to create a database to say, look at the size of our database and we know all of this. We're doing it to drive behavior change and behavior upgrade. We're doing it to support them on their journey. Chris, you talked up front about outcome goals, but we need to get to process goals that ladder up to that outcome goal, right? Like, that's what we're doing. So no, I very much appreciate that. So my very last question then for the group, and then we wrap this up, is you all sit in a different, quote unquote, and when I say each of you, what you represent in the industry. If you're all under one roof, you're still sitting in different offices, right? So we've got the integration piece. Brent, what do you guys do in the facilities to make sure that you are forcing integration? And here's why I asked. So when I was coaching in our Florida facility, we learned by mistakes. We had those scenarios going on of like guy training in PT, they do something in PT on the weight room floor, guy gets hurt, right? And we had too many of those conversations. The PT, like the classic, like PT blaming strength coach, like, man, like you hurt my guy. Like we had a setback, like his back is flared up now. And when you look at that, and what we start to learn is we needed to be better about having our conversations. And there was one a friend, colleague, individual I worked with. He's in the NBA now, but he had come from a school setting, D1 school, where they had actually, their AD had to go to court to be on the stand in a negligence lawsuit, right? Like this is, and so I think this is the thing to call it for our industry, because we never think that could happen. But his whole point to us was, you think you're integrated, you think passing a Post-it note is sufficient, until your ass is on the stand on a trial saying, did you do everything you can to support this individual, right? Like negligence. And I tell you what, like we instituted Wednesday afternoon meetings. We sit as a staff, we talk about every single person in there, new and existing, updated, and we prioritized it. Do not set your dentist appointment for Wednesday afternoon because that's a meeting you can miss. It's the top priority. Can you tell me what you've done in the facilities? And as you oversee Pro Elite for all 4 of our facilities now, where we are, like, how do you ensure integration of the information coming from each discipline?
Yeah, sure. You nailed it. Boy, you talk about somebody puckering up real tight. Gosh, you got to, somebody pulls a microphone out at a deposition or something like that and starts asking you questions, you start crossing T's and dotting I's, don't you? But yeah, I completely agree. It's absolutely vital. I think that there's a number of ways that it gets executed inside of our building, but that's a post-it note, like you mentioned earlier. Those are water cooler or like pass by you conversations, or somebody's sitting at their desk and you come in and lean in and say, hey, I want to catch up with you on this athlete. Here's what I saw. Here's how we can tie that together. But yeah, those personnel meetings are vital. And there's times when we have 50 athletes in our building and we can only logistically have one meeting per week. And if that's the case, then we have to get through all 50 athletes. And so the way that we run those is, the dietitian will start giving her update first. And if that takes 2 minutes or 5 minutes, we wait. And then when that person finishes, we go to the therapist, and the therapist talks about what's going on internally and what their strategies are. And then we go to the coach, and we even can take it to the administrative side too, because we've got admin people that are in our building. And sometimes there are conflicts with an athlete coming in and out, or he's got a flight, he's got to go somewhere. So that starts to change the training plan. But yeah, those conversations are critical. We're constantly striving to do better inside of that piece. So, dashboards and utilizing APIs and integrating in with Kitman Labs and things of that sort are ways that we're trying to evolve and continually get better. But I mean, I've had amazing conversations with dietitians about where athletes are. And Shannon was talking about a guy who was just trying to lose body fat. And a couple of years ago, I had a kid that was going to be, if he wasn't going to be the fastest kid at the combine, it was going to be top 5. And he came in at 3.8% body fat is what we got him at. And so it was a constant struggle to figure out where we can keep him safe. He was at 3.8% body fat, and he lived off of Subway sandwiches and had a really hard time adapting to high quality food. So we knew he wasn't getting loads of great nutrients to help himself, refuel. And at the end of the day, it was like we had to start pulling exercises off of him because his body fat was so low. We were concerned about him not being able to be safe whenever he went to compete at the combine. And so we had to have that conversation. Like your body fat's moved into an area where we're not comfortable sprinting you all the time. And so in order to deliver you as safe as possible, we're going to have to back off of some of these exercises. But that's something that we wouldn't have known if we didn't have that conversation, And so it's critical.
Yeah. I appreciate that. And I'm looking at the clock. We're up on time. This has been a valuable conversation for me. I think I like to host these panels because it makes me think of how to organize my thoughts of what I need to put into internal education for our own company. But my takeaways as I heard that unfold, and what I love about this is these were not written down before, and this was no prep. But if you guys hold me accountable here, when it comes to assessment, you're not just building a database. Have your list. Like if you're a professional out there working with athletes, do you have your list of the things that you want to assess, and they're not just all based around movement? Do you have mindset, nutrition, movement, and recovery? Even if you don't have all of those professionals in your building, do you have across mindset, nutrition, movement, recovery, your list that you want to assess? Then know that there is an athlete experience to care about. So if you then hit everything on the list day one, you're probably going to fail. There's the art of it. So then prioritize your list. What has to happen early? What can wait a week or two? Then from there, ID on your list which things you can tick off organically. What can you fit into your training? What can you fit into just casual conversations during a warm up? And start ticking off your list that way, taking notes after. Make it an organic process. And then once you start picking off your list, you can now go back and identify gaps. And this is where it is key to identify gaps in integrating with other professionals that you work with. Got to integrate and prioritize a weekly meeting. If you share athletes with any other professionals in it, have to have a regular meeting cadence that has to be prioritized. And then from there, that lets all of you as a team build, going back to Chris, what you said right up front, that lets you now build process goals that will ladder up to the person's outcome goal. And you show them that so you connect the dots. We need to work on doing this every day, day in, day out, because it is your barrier stopping you from getting to this that you want to do. And now you've got buy-in. Brent, Chris, Omi, Shannon, thank you so much for the time. I love the conversation. I enjoyed and I took away things from it. I hope you guys did too. But many thanks for your time. And I'm sure we'll have you all back at some point on another panel in the future.